Hello. In 1755, Great Britain and France went to war over possession of the North American continent. This is known over here as the French and Indian War, and in Europe it was just part of the wider 7 Years' War. So anyway, the French decided to build a fort between Lake George and Lake Champlain. Now, these lakes form part of the water system because, of course, at that time in the Americas, the major transportation routes were waterborne. So this was the traditional Iroquois Highway, as it was called, that was used for both trade and war. It was also the soft underbelly, you might say, of Montreal. So the French decided to build a fort at the bottom of Lake Champlain, which they called Carillon. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But apparently it's got its name because the nearby river, the Portage, the water sounded like the chiming of bells. So, they built Fort Carillon in 1755 to I think about 1756, 57. And then the British, under Lord Abercrombie, I think it was, a British and American army marched up through New York State to attack Fort Carillon. Now, when Montcalm and his French regular army showed up, they realized that Carillon was actually quite indefensible, mostly because it was not that well made, the masonry was poor, and the place was run down, but mostly because Fort Carillon was badly sited, being dominated by a number of hills surrounding it. So instead of occupying the fort, they built palisades in front of the fort to cut off the peninsula the fort was on. And the British Army, which outnumbered them quite a bit, showed up, and instead of using the siege artillery train that the British had brought with great effort through the wilderness, Lord Abercrombie ordered an immediate assault on the French positions, which turned into a bloody fiasco. First the British regulars, then they poured in some American provincials. The Indians, who had come with the British, a few of them, they very wisely decided they weren't going to get involved, so they just sat on a nearby hill and watched the whole thing. So they were the most sensible of the lot. So the British and American army was repulsed, and they withdrew. And then, of course, the wider campaign, Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the fall of New France, the British and Americans were able to return and take Fort Carillon without a fight, and the French blew it up and withdrew. Well, the site, though badly sited, it was still a useful transit point between the English colonies and Canada. So the British rebuilt the fort, they improved it, but still it became, a backwater. Then, of course, the American Revolution broke out, and the first confrontation was in Boston. Now, the Americans had the hill, but the British ships had the harbor. So what some Americans did is, well, let's go up to Ticonderoga and get their cannon. This is a good idea. Even though the American attack was shambolic and there was great rivalry between the troops from different states and different commanders who didn't get along, they were under-equipped, but they had the great advantage is that the British garrison didn't actually know they were at war yet. So they managed to disarm the sleeping sentry, get into the fort, arrest everybody, found the fort's grog supply, and get roaring drunk. But this is the really cool bit, is that they managed, I think it was someone named Knox, managed to transport through the wilderness heavy artillery in February and March from Ticonderoga to Boston Harbor. And with these cannon, they dominated the harbor, and the British Navy and the troops had to withdraw from Boston and relocate to the loyalist stronghold of New York City, which stayed loyal until the end of the Revolution. After that, Ticonderoga was simply allowed to fall apart and get overgrown. Now, of course, it's a tourist site. But you're probably wondering why I'm talking so much about Ticonderoga on a podcast which is ostensibly about tea. Well, it's simple. My friend Dennis, who goes out and travels a lot, he visits historical sites and whatnot, and he brought me back some of this. Yeah, you're probably not sure if you can see that all well. This is Ticonderoga tea. Yes. No, they don't plant tea there. They don't make tea there. They call it, the only reason they're selling tea at the Ticonderoga historical site is because it's gunpowder tea. See, it's a fort, cannon, gunpowder. So they sell gunpowder tea, which, it's a tenuous connection, but, Now, of course, gunpowder tea is a form of green tea which is tightly bound, tightly into little sort of loops and knots. And when the tea was first discovered, I believe by a Dutchman in Sumatra, he, to him, the gunpowder tea twists, very tightly wound twists, reminded him of the way gunpowder was twisted. Gunpowder was actually transported in these sort of twists at some point, and so he called the gunpowder tea. Of course, some people also say it's because the smokiness of gunpowder tea reflects the smoke of gunpowder smoke. But, it's not actually all that smoky. I don't really taste much, if any, smoke at all. But fortunately for me, gunpowder tea is one of my favorite of the greens. So here we go. I'm going to try this out. Yes. I can taste the revolution in the tea. Well, no, I can't. But, it is nice. It's a nice, straightforward gunpowder tea. Nothing. I have no problems with gunpowder tea. I'm just kind of impressed that somebody went to the trouble of producing special gunpowder tea for tourists at Ticonderoga, now in New York State. So, cheers.